The last time this county filed paperwork calling me dead, I was standing in my own driveway, holding a boarding pass with my name still printed across the top of it.
Well, what used to be my driveway.
40 hours earlier, I'd been in a metal folding chair on the other side of the world, signing out of a billet nobody back home was allowed to ask me about. Now I was standing on a strip of torn-up gravel in Prince William County, Virginia, looking at a chain-link fence where my father's hay barn used to be, and a sign the size of a delivery truck that read, "Meridian Crest Development proudly presents Quantico Landing, a legacy community." Legacy. That was the word they picked. I want you to remember that word, because by the end of this story, it's going to mean something different to you than it does right now. I set my sea bag down in the grass because my hands had started to shake, and I didn't trust myself to hold both the bag and my temper at the same time. 22 years in the Marine Corps teaches you to notice when your own body is lying to you about how calm you are. A man in a reflective vest jogged toward me before I'd taken 3 steps past the fence line. Private security, not county. Young, polite, absolutely certain he was in the right. "Ma'am, this is an active construction site. I'm going to need you to head back to the road." "This is my father's farm." "This is Meridian Crest property, ma'am. Parcel 441. He said the parcel number like it settled something, like numbers were supposed to make me feel better about a bulldozer where my bedroom used to be. I gave him my name. I gave him my rank out of old habit, which did nothing for him because he was 24 and had never once in his life needed to care what a lieutenant colonel was. He radioed it in anyway, because that's what he was trained to do with a stubborn trespasser, and 4 minutes later a Prince William County Sheriff's cruiser came up the new asphalt access road that used to be our fence line. Lights on, no siren. The deputy was young too. Everyone gets young when you've been gone 3 years. He ran my license. I watched his face do the thing faces do when a screen tells them something that doesn't match what their eyes are seeing. He looked at me, he looked at the screen, he walked 6 feet away and made a phone call with his back turned, the particular posture of a man who has just been handed a problem above his pay grade. When he came back, his hand was resting near his belt. Not on anything, just near it. The way you rest a hand near a door you might need to close in a hurry. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right there for me." "Deputy, what does the screen say?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he asked if I had any other form of identification, and I gave him my retired reserve ID, and he ran that too, and that came back wrong as well, which is a special kind of wrong, because that card comes out of a federal system, not a county one. It took his supervisor, a woman named Sergeant Whitlow, who'd clearly seen more of the world than her deputy had, about 90 seconds to say the sentence out loud that I'd already half-guessed from the shape of everyone's silence. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield, according to what we're showing, you're deceased. Died overseas about 14 months ago. That's what's on file with the county, and it looks like it's what's on file with the Department of Defense, too." I had spent 3 years training foreign logistics officers how to move fuel, food, and ammunition across a hostile coastline without losing a single pallet to enemy fire or bad math. I had never once lost track of an asset that large. Someone had lost track of me. Or, more precisely, and this is the part that took me another 6 weeks to fully understand, someone had made sure I got lost on purpose. My name is Helen Whitfield. Before any of this, if you'd asked people around Nokesville who I was, most of them would have said Walter's older girl, the one who joined the Marines. A few of the veterans down at the American Legion post would have told you I ran logistics for a Marine Expeditionary Force, which sounds impressive until you explain that it means I spent my career making sure the right amount of diesel fuel showed up in the right place at the right time, year after year, so that other people got to do the parts of the job that make it onto recruiting posters. I liked it that way. Logistics doesn't get statues built to it. It gets convoys that arrive on schedule. I always thought that was a fair trade. My father, Walter Whitfield, farmed 340 acres of that Virginia clay for 51 years, in between 2 tours in Korea he almost never talked about, and 40 years of talking about almost nothing else but soybeans, cattle, and the Washington Senators, a baseball team that stopped existing before I was old enough to remember it. He was not a sentimental man on the surface. Underneath, he was the only man I ever met who cried at the national anthem every single time, without fail, for 50 years. He had 2 daughters. I left for Paris Island the week I turned 19. My younger sister, Vivian, stayed. I want to be careful here,
because it would be easy to make this into a simple story about a good sister and a bad one, and it was never that simple, not for one day of our lives.
Vivian was sharper than me in every way that doesn't show up on a fitness report. She could read a room, close a deal, and make a stranger feel like the only person in the building, all before her coffee got cold. She built a real estate career out of nothing but charm and a punishing work ethic. And for a long time, I was proud of her, the way you're proud of someone who's better than you at something you never wanted to be good at.
What I didn't understand, what I don't think I let myself understand, was how much it cost her to watch our father's face light up every single time I came home in uniform and go merely polite every time she closed a deal that put money in his account. He had a line he repeated every year, usually after his third beer at Thanksgiving, something about the farm and who deserved it, and I always took it for sentiment. I didn't find out until much later exactly what Vivian had been hearing instead.
He died 5 years ago this past spring. Heart, sudden, no warning, in the seat of his old Ford tractor at the edge of the North Hayfield. His will left the farm to me outright, with a note attached in his own crooked handwriting. Take care of it. Don't sell it to anybody who can't tell good dirt from bad. He left Vivian the life insurance and a smaller parcel near the county road that she'd sold within a year to fund her first big development project, one that failed spectacularly 2 years later, and left her, according to paperwork I'd eventually see, more than $4 million in debt to 3 different private lenders who were not the kind of people who send a card at Christmas.
I didn't know about that debt. I didn't ask. That's on me, and I've made my peace with saying so. 3 years ago, I got orders I couldn't discuss with anyone, an unaccompanied advisory billet working with a partner nation's logistics command on the other side of the world. Communications restricted, mail restricted, personal contact restricted to short, monitored calls, maybe once every 6 or 8 weeks if the schedule allowed it. Before I left, I did what any reasonable person heading into a communications blackout does. I gave my sister limited power of attorney to keep the farm's bills paid, the taxes current, and the lights on in a house nobody would be living in. I signed those papers in Grant Pemberton's office, our father's old attorney, a man I'd known since I was in braces. I remember he shook my hand at the door and told me to be safe over there, and I remember thinking, in the unremarkable way you think things that turn out to matter later, that he looked tired for a man who mostly did closings and wills in a county where nothing ever happened. 3 years is a long time to be gone from a place. It is a longer time to be gone from people who have decided quietly and privately exactly what they intend to do with the space you've left behind. The sheriff's department didn't arrest a dead woman. To their credit, Sergeant Whitlow looked at me for a long moment, looked at the 2 forms of identification that both said I didn't exist anymore, and made the only call that actually made sense. "I'm not putting cuffs on somebody standing in front of me breathing," she said, "but I can't clear you to be on this property either. Not with what's showing on our end. You're going to need to go sort this out with the county, and I'm guessing with your own people too." That was the most honest sentence anyone said to me for the next 3 days. The Prince William County Circuit Court Clerk's office opened at 8 the next morning. I was standing at the counter at 8:01, in the same travel clothes I'd worn off the plane, because my uniforms, my furniture, my father's old roll-top desk, and every photograph I owned had gone into a dumpster or a storage unit I hadn't been told about, somewhere I hadn't been told either. The clerk who pulled my file was a woman named Renee, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the kind of civil servant who has seen every category of human disaster come through her window and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. She was not unkind. She was, if anything, unsettled, which I noticed, because unsettled clerks are rare and worth paying attention to. "Petition for presumptive death," she said, turning her monitor so I could see it, which she probably wasn't supposed to do. "Filed 12 months ago. Granted after the standard notice period. No contest filed. Estate closed 11 months ago. Sole heir, Vivian Whitfield." She looked up at me over the reading glasses. I processed the closing paperwork myself. I remember it because it's not common, a service member case. We get maybe one every few years. "What was the basis for the petition? For presumptus?" She pulled a second document, official Department of Defense letterhead, a casualty correspondence memo referencing a training incident, a helicopter support exercise, at a base I had never once set foot on, in a country I hadn't been assigned to in 11 years. I have signed enough Marine Corps correspondence in my career to know within 4 seconds that the memo in front of me had the wrong format for a casualty notification, the wrong originating command, and a signature block for an officer I'd never served under, at a duty station that had been closed for restructuring 2 years before the date on the letter. "This is a forgery," I said. Renee didn't argue with me. She just sat very still for a second. The way people sit still when they realize they've been part of something they didn't know they were part of.
"I need you to make me a copy of everything in that file," I said, "today, and I need the name of the attorney who filed the petition."
She already knew, and so did I, before she turned the screen enough for me to read it myself. Grant Pemberton, Esquire, Petitioner's Counsel. I drove to Pemberton's office without calling ahead, which I recognize now was less an investigative strategy than the last controlled thing my temper let me do that week.
His receptionist told me he was in a closing. I told her I'd wait, and I sat in his waiting room for 40 minutes, looking at the same watercolor of the Bull Run battlefield that had hung on that wall since I was in high school, until he came out to see what all the not leaving was about. And his face did something I want to describe carefully, because it wasn't shock. Shock is what the deputy showed me. This was different. This was the look of a man doing fast arithmetic.
"Helen," he said my name like a man testing ice. "You're supposed to be..."
"Dead, I've heard." I set the copied casualty memo on his desk between us. "You filed a presumptive death petition based on this. I need you to explain to me how you came to believe it was genuine."
To his credit, he didn't try to bluff his way through it. Not that day. What he did instead was worse, in its way. He sat down heavily, put both hands flat on the desk like he was steadying a boat, and said, "Helen, you need to talk to your sister before this goes any further. There are things about the last 3 years that are complicated, and I am not the right person to explain them to you."
"You filed the petition, Grant."
I filed a petition based on documentation Vivian brought me from a source I had every reason at the time to consider reliable. His voice had the careful, over-formal cadence of a man rehearsing a sentence he expected to say again under oath eventually. "I have represented this family for 30 years. I would ask you to remember that before you decide what kind of man I am." I noticed 2 things in that meeting that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. The first was that the notary stamp on the original petition, dated 14 months before I ever walked back into this county, put Vivian in Prince William County on a Tuesday. She had, according to a travel itinerary I would eventually subpoena, then photographed at a developers conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, 400 miles away. The second was smaller and almost slipped past me. When I asked Pemberton point blank whether he'd ever personally spoken to anyone at the Department of Defense to verify the casualty memo, he looked down at his own hands for just a second too long before he said, "I had no reason to doubt paperwork on official letterhead." That is not a yes. In 30 years of watching people account for cargo that didn't arrive where it was supposed to, I have learned that "I had no reason to doubt it" is what people say instead of no when they already know the answer is going to hurt them. I left his office with a copy of the notary log, the itinerary discrepancy sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone, and the beginning of a decision I hadn't fully made yet. I was not going to walk into my sister's life and demand an explanation. Not yet. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a forged form and a confused old attorney, and I had spent 22 years learning that the fastest way to lose a war is to reveal your position before you understand the size of the force you're up against. The next call I made was to Dana Ruiz. Dana had been my logistics chief for 6 years, across 2 duty stations, a master gunnery sergeant who could find a missing pallet of night vision batteries faster than most people could find their car keys, and who'd retired 18 months before I deployed to take a civilian job doing records compliance work for a veterans service organization in Alexandria. If anyone I knew could tell me how a living officer ends up dead on paper in 3 different systems, it was her. She picked up on the second ring, said my name like a question, and then didn't say anything else for a full 5 seconds, which from Dana was the equivalent of another person bursting into tears. "They told me you were..." "I heard. I'm not." "Get somewhere I can see your face," she said, "because I need to look at you while you tell me that." We met that evening at a diner off Route 28.
a place with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since before either of us enlisted, and I told her everything I had, which at that point wasn't much. A forged casualty memo, a probate petition, a family attorney with shaking hands, and a farm that no longer existed.
Dana listened the way she used to listen to supply reports, waiting for the number that didn't reconcile.
Deers doesn't just update itself off a county probate filing, she said finally. Somebody had to push a casualty status change from inside the Department of Defense's own record system. That's not your sister's real estate lawyer submitting a form to a courthouse. That's somebody with an actual login.
How does a civilian buy that kind of access?
They don't buy the access, Dana said. They buy the person who already has it.
That was the sentence that turned this from a family dispute into something else. I spent the next 11 days doing what I'd spent 22 years training to do, building a supply chain, except the cargo this time was proof, and every link had to be independently verifiable. Because I understood by then that if I was wrong about the size of this, or wrong about my sister's role in it, the damage of being wrong out loud would be worse than the damage of staying quiet a while longer. Dana connected me with a friend of hers, a Defense Criminal Investigative Service agent named Renata Cole, who worked government contract fraud out of the Washington field office. I remember being surprised at how unsurprised Agent Cole was when I laid it out for her in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee. We've had eyes on a company called Meridian Crest Development for about 4 months, she told me, sliding a manila folder half an inch across the table, and then visibly deciding not to slide it any further until she'd heard more from me. Not because of a death certificate, because of a bid package. Meridian Crest, it turned out, had been awarded preliminary standing on a $260 million mixed-use logistics and workforce housing contract tied to base support infrastructure near Quantico, a project marketed publicly as Quantico Landing. Preliminary standing that came in significant part from the company's certification as a veteran-owned small business, eligible for a federal set-aside. A certification built on the paperwork of a service-disabled Marine Corps officer whose signature appeared on the ownership documents, whose combat zone service record appeared in the qualifying file, and whose name was Helen Whitfield. I never signed those documents, I said. I believe you, Agent Cole said, which is a problem for a company that's currently 3 weeks from closing a $40 million bridge loan against the strength of that certification. I want to tell you that in that moment, I felt triumphant, like the pieces of a puzzle sliding into a satisfying picture. I didn't. What I felt, sitting in that windowless federal conference room with my father's brass surveying compass still riding around in the bottom of my sea bag because I hadn't had anywhere else to put it, was something closer to grief with the pin pulled out of it. My sister hadn't just stolen a signature. She had built an entire structure, floor by floor, on top of a version of me that didn't exist and couldn't say no. 2 nights later, against every piece of advice Dana and Agent Cole had given me, I drove to Vivian's townhouse in Haymarket and knocked on her door. She opened it in workout clothes, phone still in her hand, and for 1 full second, I will swear to this on anything you want me to swear on, her face went somewhere honest. Not guilty, exactly. Undone. Like watching a levee find out water can, in fact, go over the top of it. Then it closed back up, fast, the way a good negotiator's face always does. Helen. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how I was alive. She stepped back and let me in like she'd been rehearsing this exact doorway in her head for over a year, which I would later learn in court she had. You should have called first. You buried me, Viv. I fixed a mess that was going to bury both of us, she said, and there was real heat behind it, real conviction, the kind you can't fake even if you're as good at faking things as my sister is. Do you have any idea what those loans from Dad's failed project were doing to me? Do you have any idea what it's like to watch a bank threaten to take your house while your sister's off doing something so secret she can't even tell you the country she's standing in? So you decided the solution was to declare me dead and steal my name. I decided the solution was to finally use something this family has that's actually worth something, she said. And here's the part that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else that happened that year. She wasn't ashamed when she said it. She believed it. Dad said the farm should go to whoever wears the uniform. Fine. I wore it too, Helen. I wore it every single day I sat in this county cleaning up messes while you were off being a hero 4,000 miles away. I earned that certification as much as you did. I just didn't have the paperwork.
I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count, trying to find the place where I could have said something that reached her. I don't think that place exists. Some people don't want to be reached. They want to be right, and if they can't be right, they'll settle for winning.
Some doors are better left closed, Helen, she said as I turned to leave, and her voice had gone very calm, very level, the voice she probably used to close 8-figure deals. You should think hard about which one you're about to walk through. There are a lot of people counting on Quantico Landing closing on schedule. Investors, the county, veterans I've hired who have real jobs riding on this. You reappearing and blowing all of that up doesn't just hurt me. It was the first time in the whole ordeal that I understood exactly how dangerous she planned to make this for me if I let her. It was also, though neither of us knew it yet, the moment she handed me my no-return decision, without meaning to, because up until that conversation, some small, stupid part of me had still been holding out room for a private resolution, a returned signature, a quiet correction, a sister who'd panicked and could still be talked down. Standing in her doorway, listening to her use other people's jobs as a shield, I understood there wasn't going to be a private version of this. There was only a public one, done right, or a private one, done wrong, that would leave her free to do this to someone else next. I called Agent Cole from the car before I'd even pulled out of the parking lot. I'm in, I told her. Tell me what you need from me to build this the right way. For the next 5 weeks, I did the hardest thing logistics ever asks of a person. I waited, on schedule, according to someone else's timeline, while the thing I most wanted to stop kept moving forward in plain sight. Agent Cole's team, working alongside an FBI financial crimes agent named Owen Bridges, and eventually an assistant U.S. attorney named Diane Okafor, needed more than my word and a stack of copied county documents. They needed the falsified Deers entry traced to its source. They needed the investor paperwork. They needed, more than anything, to understand exactly how deep the fraud went before they moved. Because a case built too early against a project with $260 million of momentum behind it doesn't just fail. It gets buried under its own lawyers before it ever sees daylight. So I went quiet. Officially, publicly. As far as the world was concerned, Lieutenant Colonel Helen Whitfield remained exactly what the paperwork said she was. I spent those weeks in a corporate apartment in Woodbridge that DCIS arranged, going through document productions with Agent Cole most mornings, and in the afternoons, more than once, driving past the fence line of my father's farm, just to watch the shape of a hotel tower rise where the hay barn used to be. I am not going to pretend that was healthy. It wasn't. But I needed to see it, the way you need to look directly at a wound sometimes, instead of only feeling it. It was during those weeks that I first heard the name Marcus Alden. He came up in a public relations packet Meridian Crest sent to investors, and eventually to Agent Cole's team as part of a standard document request. Director of Veteran Community Relations, a former Army combat engineer who'd lost most of the use of his left hand to an IED outside Kandahar, and had spent the 8 years since building a small but respected nonprofit that helped veterans transition into skilled trades. His photograph was on half of Meridian Crest's marketing materials, standing next to Vivian in a hard hat, smiling under a banner that read, "Built by Veterans, for Veterans." He's not part of this, Agent Cole told me, tapping his file. Not knowingly, anyway. We've had eyes on him, too. He believes every word of what he's saying in these interviews. I asked her how that was possible, and her answer is one I have thought about often since. Because your sister didn't just forge your paperwork, Colonel. She built a story people wanted to be true, and then found honest people to stand inside it. That's what makes this kind of fraud so hard to unwind cleanly. The lie needs believers who aren't lying. 3 weeks before the scheduled ribbon cutting, Meridian Crest held an investor gala at a hotel ballroom in Woodbridge to close the final tranche of its bridge financing, $40 million that would let construction finish on schedule. I watched a live stream of it alone in that corporate apartment because Agent Cole had asked me, in the plainest terms she had, not to go anywhere near it.
Vivian stood at a podium under a screen the size of a garage door showing renderings of a development I would never live to see finished the way it was drawn, and she gave a speech I have transcribed from memory more times than I'd like to admit, because certain sentences don't leave you.
"This project exists," she said, "because of my sister, Lieutenant Colonel Helen Whitfield, a woman who served this country for over 2 decades and who I lost far too young, far too far from home. Every dollar of veteran opportunity this development creates is a tribute to what she believed in. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure her name means something in this county." I sat in a rented apartment with my father's compass in my hand and listened to my sister use my death, a death she had manufactured with a forged signature and a bribed records clerk, as the emotional centerpiece of a pitch to raise $40 million.
Marcus Alden spoke after her. He talked with real feeling in his voice about what it had meant to him to work for a company that, in his words, actually keeps its promises to veterans instead of just putting us in the brochure. He didn't know he was standing on a lie built with my forged name. I could hear, even through a laptop speaker 4 counties away, that he believed every word.
That was the night the plan Agent Cole and I had been quietly building stopped being about vindication for me and started being about something bigger. Whatever happened next had to protect people like Marcus, who'd built something real on top of something false, without knowing the difference. My sister had not just stolen from me. She had spent an honest man's credibility to do it. I called Agent Cole the next morning and told her I wanted one thing added to whatever plan they built. I wanted Marcus separated from the fallout before the fallout ever happened. She told me that wasn't standard procedure. "Make it standard," I said, "or I walk into that ribbon cutting and do this my own way, on my own timeline." She was quiet for a second, and then she said in the driest voice I ever heard from her, "You'd have made an excellent case agent, Colonel. God help me. Let's build it your way." The final piece of the puzzle came together 9 days before the ribbon cutting, and it came from a place I hadn't expected, a compliance officer at the regional bank underwriting Meridian Crest's bridge loan. As part of standard Know Your Borrower procedures for a federal set-aside linked project, the bank had recorded a verification call, required whenever a named principal on a veteran-owned certification couldn't appear in person, in which Helen Whitfield confirmed in her own voice her ownership stake and her authorization for Meridian Crest to use her certification on the Quantico landing bid. I had never made that call. I was, according to every record in 3 different government systems, dead at the time it supposedly took place. Agent Bridges played the recording for me in a conference room at the FBI's Washington field office, and I will tell you honestly that for about 4 seconds, it worked on me too. It was my voice, my cadence, my particular flat way of saying affirmative instead of yes, that I picked up so early in my career I don't remember not doing it. Even a small habit I have of clearing my throat before a formal statement. For one disorienting second, I found myself doing something I never expected to do in my life, searching my own memory for a call I was certain I hadn't made, the specific vertigo of doubting your own certainty about your own life. It was uncanny enough that Agent Bridges watched my face carefully while it played, the way you watch someone's face when you already suspect what they're about to feel. "It's built from your change of command speech," he told me when it ended, and something in me came back down to the ground. 11 minutes of you speaking, publicly posted, edited into new sentences by a voice cloning service. Whoever did this spent real money and real time on it. This wasn't a scared woman panicking. This was planned, professionally, months in advance. That recording did 2 things for the case that nothing else had managed. First, it moved the fraud definitively out of family dispute territory and into federal wire fraud and identity theft territory, because someone had knowingly submitted a synthetic recording of a deceased on-paper officer to a federally regulated lender to secure financing on a government-adjacent contract. Second, and this is the part that mattered most to me personally, it proved something no county document ever could. My sister hadn't stumbled into this. She had commissioned my voice. Agent Cole, Agent Bridges, and AUSA Okafor spent the next several days building the timing of the takedown around one fact. Meridian Crest's final loan disbursement and its federal contract standing both hinged on the ribbon-cutting ceremony proceeding as publicly announced, with Vivian as principal, formally certifying the project's veteran ownership compliance one last time, in front of press, investors, and a county supervisor who was up for re-election and had tied his campaign to the development. If we move before the ceremony, she has time to restructure, blame a subordinate, maybe even blame Pemberton and walk away with a settlement, Okafor told me. If we move during it, in front of the exact people whose money and trust she's been standing on, there's no version of the story she gets to write afterward. The public record becomes the true one, in real time, with you standing right there as the correction. I didn't love the idea of turning my own resurrection into theater. 22 years of logistics work teaches you to prize the quiet, efficient solution over the dramatic one. But Okafor was right about one thing I couldn't argue with. Vivian had built her entire scheme out of narrative, out of the story she could tell a room full of believing strangers. The only way to beat a story like that was with a truer one, told at the exact moment and in the exact room where hers was about to close its final chapter.
All right, I said, let's do it in front of everyone.
Quantico Landing's grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday morning in October, bright and cold, the kind of Virginia fall day my father used to call good hanging laundry weather. 400 folding chairs faced a stage built on what I was fairly sure, from the angle of the old fence line still visible in the churned-up dirt, used to be roughly where our kitchen window looked out over the north pasture. I stood in the back of a catering tent in a set of dress blues I hadn't worn in over a year, feeling every one of my father's old warnings about pride sitting uncomfortably in my chest, while Agent Cole ran through the plan one final time in a voice pitched low enough not to carry. "You wait for her to reach the ribbon," she said, "not before. We need the certification statement on the record, on camera, before we move, or a good defense attorney turns this into an entrapment argument in about 6 minutes. The second she says it, you come out from stage left. Agent Bridges and I come in from the loading area with the marshals. Okafor's already got the judge on standby for the injunction. Nobody touches you. Nobody touches Marcus Alden, unless he does something none of us expect him to do, which he won't."
And if she runs?
"She won't run," Agent Cole said. "People like your sister don't run from a room full of people they've spent their whole life trying to impress. They freeze. Trust me." The ceremony began the way these things always do, with a county supervisor thanking exactly the right number of donors by name, and a high school color guard I recognized from my own graduating class's alma mater, 30 years apart, presenting a flag to a crowd that had no idea it was about to watch federal law enforcement serve an injunction between the anthem and the ribbon. Vivian took the stage in a cream-colored coat, radiant in the particular way of someone who has convinced herself that the hardest part is already behind her. She thanked the investors. She thanked the county. She thanked, once again, the memory of my sister, Lieutenant Colonel Helen Whitfield, without whose service and sacrifice none of this would exist. Then, exactly as the plan required, she turned to the microphone one last time to complete the compliance formality nobody in that crowd understood the weight of. "As principal and certified veteran owner of Meridian Crest Development, I hereby confirm this project's continued eligibility and compliance under federal veteran-owned small business standards, in good faith and to the best of my knowledge." I walked out from behind the stage curtain into October sunlight, in front of 400 strangers, a dead woman in dress blues, and I watched my sister Stace do the thing Agent Cole had promised me it would do. She didn't run. She froze, one hand still resting on the ribbon-cutting scissors, her whole body gone rigid, the way a supply line goes rigid, the instant everyone realizes the truck isn't coming. "Vivian," I said, and my voice carried further in that quiet than I expected it to, because 400 people had all stopped breathing at the same moment. I'd like to correct the record on eligibility. I don't remember every word I said next. Not the way you remember something you rehearsed. I remember holding up my military ID and reading my own name and service number out loud to a crowd that had just watched my sister call me dead for the 3rd time that morning. I remember a woman in the 3rd row putting both hands over her mouth. I remember a reporter I recognized from the local paper standing up so fast her folding chair went over backward. What I remember most clearly is Marcus Alden, 3 feet from Vivian on that stage, turning to look at me with an expression that had nothing to do with fear
and everything to do with a man doing very fast, very painful arithmetic of his own, recognizing, in real time, exactly which parts of the last 8 months of his life had been real and which parts hadn't.
Agent Cole and Agent Bridges came up the side stairs with 2 federal marshals a half second after I finished speaking, and Diane Okafor, who I hadn't even seen arrive, stepped up to the microphone with a folded document in her hand.
Miss Whitfield, she said to Vivian, I have a federal court order, effective immediately, halting all construction, financial disbursement, and contract activity associated with the Quantico Landing Project, pending investigation into wire fraud, identity theft, and false claims related to federal set-aside eligibility.
Vivian's mouth opened. For 1 full second, I watched my sister, brilliant, ferocious, always 3 moves ahead of everyone else in any room she walked into, have absolutely nothing to say. Then the professional instinct that had built her entire career took over, and she turned toward the crowd, toward the cameras, and said the only thing left in her that could still function under that kind of pressure.
This is a misunderstanding. My sister's identity was tragically—
Ma'am, one of the marshals said, not unkindly, you'll have the chance to say all of that to a judge.
They didn't handcuff her on that stage. They didn't need to. The county supervisor, who'd tied his re-election to the ribbon in her hand, was already walking briskly toward the parking lot with his phone against his ear. The investors in the front row were doing the math on $40 million in real time, in public, on their faces. And Marcus Alden, disabled combat engineer, honest believer, stood in the middle of the collapse of the first thing he'd built since Kandahar that had made him feel useful again, looking at me like he needed me to tell him whether any of it had been real.
I walked over to him before I did anything else, before I answered a single reporter's question, because some things matter more than the moment you've been waiting 14 months for.
None of what you did for the veterans in that hiring program was a lie, I told him. You believed it because you built something real inside something rotten. That's not the same as being part of the rot. I'll make sure the people writing about this today understand the difference.
I don't know if he believed me right then. I wouldn't have in his position, but it was the first thing I said out loud as a legally living person again, and I have never regretted choosing to say it before anything else.
The trial started 4 months later in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, in a courtroom with worn brass fixtures and a portrait of a long-dead judge whose stern painted eyes seemed to disapprove of everyone equally.
I won't walk you through every week of it. Trials, like supply chains, are mostly patient, unglamorous work, and the parts that matter tend to arrive in small pieces rather than dramatic ones. But a few of those pieces are worth telling you about.
Grant Pemberton took a plea agreement 11 days before trial in exchange for testimony. He took the stand looking 20 years older than the man who'd shaken my hand at his office door before I deployed, and he answered Diane Okafor's questions in the flat, careful voice of a man who has spent months rehearsing the worst sentences of his own life.
Why did you file a presumptive death petition? You had reason to doubt, Okafor asked him.
Because Vivian showed me proof of $180,000 she'd already paid to a records clerk who could make the Deers entry and the casualty memo look legitimate, Pemberton said. And because I owed casino debts I hadn't told my own wife about, and Vivian knew it, and she offered to make that debt disappear if I handled the filing without asking too many questions.
Did you believe Helen Whitfield was actually deceased?
A long pause. I told myself I believed the paperwork, he said. I don't think, looking back, that I ever really did.
The records clerk, a Department of Defense personnel administrator named Curtis Boyle, had already pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding weeks earlier, and his plea agreement laid out, in flat bureaucratic language, exactly how $180,000 in 3 payments had bought a single false status change in a system meant to protect the records of every service member who has ever worn the uniform.
The voice recording came in through an FBI forensic audio analyst who walked the jury through the technical fingerprints of synthetic speech, the unnatural evenness in certain vowel transitions, the absence of the small human noises, breath, throat clearing, the almost inaudible catch before a hard consonant, that a real recorded voice always carries, and a cloned one, even an expensive one, almost never fully replicates.
The defendant's company paid $11,000 to a voice synthesis contractor operating out of a shared office space in Tyson's Corner, the analyst testified, specifically to produce audio matching Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield's speech patterns for use in a bank verification call.
Vivian's attorneys tried what defense attorneys in cases like this almost always try. They argued that Deere's error was a records mistake elsewhere in the system, that the voice recording had an innocent explanation involving an old marketing consultant, that Vivian herself had been misled by people around her she trusted too much. It is a strange thing to watch a room full of professionals try to build a version of your sister that makes her a victim of her own scheme, when you were standing in her doorway the night she told you plainly, in her own words, that she believed she'd earned the right to become you.
Vivian took the stand in her own defense on the second Thursday of the trial, and for the first 90 minutes, she was very good. She always had been. She spoke about our father, about growing up in his shadow, about watching a lifetime of quiet effort get overshadowed every single time by a uniform she never got to wear. Several jurors, I noticed, were nodding along, the way people do when a true feeling gets used to cover an untrue set of facts.
Then Okafor rose for cross-examination, and she didn't raise her voice, not once, the whole time.
Miss Whitfield, do you recognize this document?
It was an email, 18 months old, sent from Vivian's personal account to Grant Pemberton. Subject line, timing. Okafor read one line of it aloud, no more.
You wrote, quote, "Helen won't check in for another 2 months at the earliest, and even then it's a 5-minute call through 3 layers of censorship. This is the window." Vivian's face didn't collapse the way I might have expected, or wanted, if I'm honest about the ugliest corner of my own heart. It went very still instead, the stillness of someone doing math and not liking the answer.
"I wrote that," she said. "This is the window," Okafor repeated. "The window for what, Miss Whitfield?" A long silence stretched through that courtroom, long enough that I heard the building's old radiator click on somewhere behind the jury box. "The window to finally have something of my own," Vivian finally said, before it was too late to matter. It was, as far as I know, the only fully honest sentence my sister said under oath that entire trial, and it broke something in me, anyway, hearing it, because it told me the truth I'd been avoiding since the night in her doorway. This had never really been about the farm, or the money, or even the contract. It had been about a decades-old scorekeeping I never knew we were both still playing. The jury deliberated for a day and a half, guilty on every count: wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy, false claims related to federal contracting, forgery of a public record.
Grant Pemberton, under his plea agreement, received 4 years. Curtis Boyle received 6. My sister was sentenced, 6 weeks later, to 16 years in federal prison, with a restitution order that stripped Meridian Crest's remaining assets down to the framework of an unfinished hotel tower on land that, under the terms of the same judgment, reverted fully back to me. 11 weeks after that, in writing, with a doctor's signature and 2 forms of biometric verification, I proved to the Department of Defense that I was alive, the strangest paperwork of my career, and became once again an unremarkable line item in a government system.
Marcus Alden was never charged with anything, because there was never anything to charge him with. I sat down with him myself 3 weeks after the ribbon cutting, in a diner not unlike the one where Dana and I had first laid out the pieces of this whole mess, and I told him what the investigation had actually found: that his hiring program, the trade apprenticeships he'd built, the mentorship relationships he'd started with 11 young veterans in that county, were real, functioning, and entirely separate from the fraud that had funded the building around them. He asked me, quietly, whether I thought that made any of it worth less. I told him no. I told him a good thing built on bad ground doesn't stop being good. It just has to be moved to better ground, and I meant it enough to help him do exactly that. 18 months later, that same apprenticeship program is running out of a converted equipment barn on a corner of my restored property, funded by a small honest grant instead of a $260 million fraud, and it is, without question, the only part of Quantico Landing that survived worth keeping. I visited my sister twice in the first year of her sentence, at a federal facility in West Virginia that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, the particular smell of every institution built to hold people who were once trusted with more. The first visit, neither of us said much worth repeating.
The second, 6 months later, she told me she'd started keeping a small notebook of every honest thing she could remember about our father. In case, she said, I start believing my own version of events again, the way I did the first time. I don't know if I've forgiven her. I have stopped needing the answer to that question to be simple. What I know is that I no longer carry her the way I carried her for that first year, as an open wound I checked on every day. And there is a kind of peace in that, even if it isn't the kind the greeting cards mean.
Grant Pemberton wrote me a letter from the county jail where he served the front half of his sentence before transfer. 4 pages, careful handwriting, no excuses in it that I could find. He wrote that he had spent 30 years believing that being useful to a family made him part of it, and that it had taken losing his license and his reputation to understand the difference between being needed and being respected. I don't visit him. I did write back once, 3 sentences, to tell him I'd read it. Some doors, as my sister once warned me, really are better left closed. She just had the wrong door in mind when she said it. Last spring, on the anniversary of the day I stood in that driveway, holding a boarding pass with a dead woman's name on it, I drove out to the farm with a sapling from a Virginia white oak, the same kind that used to shade the north pasture before a bulldozer took it down, along with everything else. And I planted it roughly where the old fence line used to run, close enough to the foundation of the unfinished hotel tower that whoever eventually finishes tearing that structure down will have to build around it if they want it to survive. I buried my father's old brass surveying compass at the base of that sapling, still in its worn leather case, the same compass that rode in the bottom of my sea bag through 3 years I can't fully talk about, and that sat in my hand while I listened to my sister raise $40 million off the story of my death. He used it his whole life to measure honest boundaries on honest land. It felt right to leave it somewhere it could keep doing that job without me standing over it, watching. I don't know exactly what I want you to take from all of this, if you've stayed with me this long. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that revenge is peace, because I don't think it is. What I found, standing in front of 400 strangers in dress blues that still fit despite everything, wasn't peace. It was accuracy. My name, my record, my land, corrected back to what they actually were, instead of what someone else needed them to be for their own reasons. If there's a lesson in it, maybe it's this. The people who use your absence against you are usually counting on you staying quiet a little longer than you actually have to. Check your own paperwork. Ask the uncomfortable questions about the family member who's been handling things while you were gone. And if you ever find out someone tried to bury you while you were still standing, don't waste your strength on rage. Spend it on accuracy instead. Rage burns out. Accuracy holds up in federal court. If this story meant something to you or reminded you of someone in your own family worth checking in on before too much time passes between you, I'd ask you to do one simple thing. Tell them. Today, if you can. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, stay close. There are more truths worth telling.